She was accused of stealing his ring, yet the Sheikh billionaire collapsed when he realized the engraving inside carried her mother's name. The rain had started hours ago, but Emily Carter barely noticed. She moved through the dining room of Le Palais d'Or like a shadow, her white apron crisp against her black uniform, her hands steady as she carried crystal glasses that cost more than her monthly rent. The restaurant glowed with golden light, chandeliers casting warm halos over tables draped in silk, where men in tailored suits and women in diamonds spoke in hushed, elegant tones. Emily had worked here for 3 years. She knew every corner of this place, every temperamental chef, every demanding guest. She knew how to be invisible when necessary, how to smile politely when addressed, how to move without making a sound. It was a skill she had perfected over years of survival, being present but unseen, helpful but unnoticed. She was 26 years old, though her eyes carried the weight of someone much older. Her light brown hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, a few rebellious strands framing a face that would have been striking if she ever allowed herself to be seen. But Emily had learned long ago that being noticed was dangerous, being invisible was safer. Tonight, the restaurant was unusually busy. A private event had been booked in the main dining room, some kind of business dinner for international clients. Emily had been assigned to assist, though she preferred the quieter sections where she could work without scrutiny. But Michael, the floor manager, had insisted. "They're big tippers, Emily. Smile. Be present." She hated when he said that. Be present. As if she wasn't already there, already working, already doing everything asked of her. The doors opened at exactly 8:15. Emily was arranging wine glasses at the corner table when she felt it, a shift in the room's energy, a sudden hush that swept through the staff like wind through trees. She glanced up and saw him. Sheikh Rashid Al Farhan entered with the kind of presence that didn't need announcement. He was tall, perhaps 6'3", with broad shoulders beneath an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. His black hair was swept back, touched with silver at the temples, and his beard was trimmed with precision. But it was his eyes that struck her. Dark, almost black, and utterly devoid of warmth. He moved through the restaurant as if he owned not just the space, but the air itself. 2 assistants flanked him, both in sharp suits, both silent. Michael rushed forward, bowing slightly, his voice suddenly honeyed and obsequious. "Sheikh Al Farhan, what an honor! Your table is ready, of course, right this way." The sheikh didn't acknowledge him. He simply walked to the corner table, the one Emily had just finished preparing, and sat down without looking at anyone. His assistants remained standing, positioned like sentinels. Emily stepped back instinctively, blending into the shadows near the service station. She watched as Michael fussed over the table, as the sommelier appeared with a wine list, as the entire restaurant seemed to orbit around this one man. "Emily." She flinched. Michael's voice was sharp, urgent. He gestured for her to approach. "You'll be serving Sheikh Al Farhan this evening. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make mistakes. Do you understand?" Her throat tightened. "Yes, sir." "And smile." She forced her lips into a thin, practiced curve and approached the table. The sheikh was reading something on his phone, his expression carved from stone. One of his assistants leaned down and whispered something in Arabic. The sheikh nodded once, still not looking up. Emily set a glass of water down gently, her hand steady, despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Le Palais d'Or. May I?" "I'll have the lamb, medium rare, no vegetables." His voice was deep, measured, and entirely disinterested. He didn't look at her. "Of course, sir. And to start?" "Nothing." Emily nodded, her smile frozen. "Yes, sir." She turned to leave, but something made her glance back, just for a second. And in that second, she saw it. On his right hand, a ring. It was gold, thick, with intricate engravings along the band. Something about it tugged at her memory, a ghost of recognition she couldn't place. Then he looked up. His eyes met hers for the first time. Emily's breath caught. There was no kindness in that gaze, no curiosity, just cold assessment, as if she were furniture. But for a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe, or recognition. Then it was gone. She hurried away, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't name. The evening progressed in its usual rhythm. Emily brought the lamb, refilled water glasses, cleared plates. The Sheikh ate in silence, his assistants occasionally speaking to him in low tones. He never looked at her again. She was invisible once more. But she couldn't stop thinking about that ring. It reminded her of something, a memory, distant and fragile, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Her mother's hands, her mother's voice, soft and sad. "Your father gave me something once, something beautiful. But I lost it, sweetheart. I lost it, and I never found it again." Emily was 8 when her mother said that. They were sitting in their tiny apartment, the one with the broken heater and the neighbor who yelled through the walls. Her mother had been crying, which wasn't unusual. Sarah Carter cried often in those last years before she died. Emily. She blinked. Michael was staring at her, his expression tight with irritation. "You're daydreaming. Sheikh Al-Farhan is ready for dessert." "Sorry. Yes, right away." She approached the table again, this time with the dessert menu. The Sheikh waved it away without looking. "Just coffee. Black." "Of course, sir." She turned toward the kitchen, but one of the assistants called out, "Wait." Emily froze. The assistant was standing now, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the Sheikh's hand, or rather, where the ring should have been. The Sheikh followed his gaze. His entire body went rigid. "Where is it?" The assistant's voice was strained. "Sir, you were wearing it when we arrived. I saw it." The Sheikh's jaw clenched. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The entire restaurant seemed to still. Even the distant clatter of the kitchen faded into silence. "Find it," the Sheikh said, his voice low and dangerous. Emily's stomach dropped. Within seconds, the assistants were searching the floor around the table, their movements frantic. Michael appeared, his face flushed. "Sheikh Al-Farhan, what has happened?" "My ring is missing." Those 4 words landed like stones. Michael's eyes widened. "Missing? But when did you—" "It was on my hand an hour ago. Now it's gone." Michael looked around wildly, his gaze landing on Emily. Her blood turned to ice. "Who's been at this table?" Michael demanded. "Just me, sir," Emily whispered. Michael's expression shifted, suspicion, sharp and immediate. "Emily, did you—" "I didn't touch anything," she said quickly. "I only brought food and water. I didn't—" "Search her!" The words hung in the air like a death sentence.
Emily stared at him, her heart hammering. "What?" "Search her," he repeated, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "She's the only one who's been close enough." "Sir, I wouldn't," Emily's voice cracked. "I didn't take anything." Michael grabbed her arm, his grip painful. "Emily, empty your pockets now." Tears burned her eyes. The entire restaurant was watching now, guests turning in their seats, staff frozen in the doorways. She was a spectacle, a criminal. With shaking hands, she reached into her apron pockets and pulled them inside out. Empty. Just a pen and a small notepad. "Check her bag," the Sheikh said. "Please," Emily whispered. "Please, I didn't do anything." But Michael was already dragging her toward the back, toward the staff lockers. She stumbled, her vision blurring with tears. This couldn't be happening. Not again. Not like before, when she'd been accused of stealing at the grocery store where she worked during college, when the manager had called her a liar, even though she'd done nothing wrong. Her locker was opened. Her small canvas bag was dumped onto the floor. A wallet, chapstick, her phone, keys. A crumpled photo. No ring. Michael looked relieved for a second, but the Sheikh wasn't satisfied. He was standing in the doorway now, his presence filling the cramped staff room. "Check the cameras," he said. Emily's legs gave out. She sank onto the bench, her hands covering her face. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The weight of his accusation, the eyes of everyone in the restaurant, the certainty in his voice, it crushed her. "I didn't take it. I swear, I didn't." Nobody listened. The cameras were reviewed. Emily was seen approaching the table, setting down plates, refilling water. At one point, her hand passed near the edge of the table, close to where the Sheikh had been sitting. Michael pointed at the screen triumphantly. "There! She was right there!" "I was putting down his coffee," Emily said, her voice breaking. "I didn't touch anything else." But the Sheikh's face was granite. "Call the police." "No," Emily gasped. "Please, please, I didn't—" "Sir?" One of the assistants interrupted. He was still searching the dining room floor. "Wait." Everyone turned. The assistant was on his knees beside the Sheikh's chair. His hand reached into the gap between the cushion and the seat frame. When he pulled it back, something glinted in his palm. The ring. The room exhaled. Michael's face went red. "Oh, I see. It must have slipped off," and the Sheikh took the ring from his assistant's hand, his expression unreadable. He slid it back on his finger without a word. Then finally, he looked at Emily. She was still sitting on the bench, her face wet with tears, her body trembling. She looked destroyed. For a moment, something passed through the Sheikh's eyes. Regret, maybe, or recognition of what he'd done. But he said nothing, no apology, no acknowledgement. He simply turned and walked out. Emily sat there long after he was gone, long after Michael muttered an uncomfortable, "Well, back to work then," long after the other staff members returned to their duties, casting her pitying glances. She sat there and felt something inside her break. That night, Emily walked home through the rain. She didn't take the subway. She needed the cold, the wet, the sharp sting of the wind against her face. She needed to feel something other than the humiliation that clung to her like smoke. Her apartment was small, a fifth-floor walk-up in a building that should have been condemned years ago. The walls were thin, the heating inconsistent, the water temperamental. But it was hers, or at least it was hers as long as she kept making rent. She dropped her bag by the door and sank onto her couch, a sagging thing she'd found on the street 3 years ago. The photo that had fallen from her bag during the search was still in her hand, crumpled and damp. She smoothed it out carefully. It was old, faded, the colors washed out. But she could still see her mother's face, Sarah Carter, 24 years old, smiling at the camera with a happiness Emily barely remembered. She was beautiful, her light hair catching the sun, her eyes bright. And on her hand, barely visible in the photo, was a ring. Emily had stared at this photo 1,000 times. She'd memorized every detail. But tonight, something clicked into place. The ring in the photo, it looked like the one the Sheikh had been wearing. No, that was impossible. She was tired, traumatized, seeing connections that didn't exist. But the thought wouldn't leave her. She opened her laptop, her hands still shaking, and searched. Sheikh Rashid Al Farhan. Pages of results flooded the screen. Photos of him at galas, at business summits, at charity events. Articles about his wealth, his real estate empire, his late wife. He was 47 years old, a member of one of the wealthiest families in the UAE, and notoriously private. Emily clicked on an older article, one from 15 years ago, a family photo. The caption read, "The Al Farhan family at the opening of the Khalid Al Farhan Memorial Foundation." Her heart stopped. In the photo, standing beside a younger Rashid, was another man, taller, broader, with kind eyes and a warm smile. The caption identified him. Khalid Al Farhan, Beloved Brother, 1965 to 1995. Emily's vision blurred. She clicked on another link, her breath coming in short gasps. Khalid Al-Farhan, heir to the Al-Farhan fortune, died tragically in a car accident at the age of 30. He was survived by his younger brother Rashid and his parents. The year her mother got pregnant. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely type. She searched again. Khalid Al-Farhan, Sarah Whitman. Nothing. She tried Khalid Al-Farhan, American woman. Still nothing. But the pieces were there, scattered and broken. Her mother had never talked about Emily's father. Never. When Emily asked as a child, Sarah would smile sadly and say, "He loved us, sweetheart, but he's gone now." Emily had always assumed he'd abandoned them. But what if he hadn't? What if he died before he even knew she existed? She stared at the photo of Khalid Al-Farhan. He had kind eyes, gentle eyes, nothing like his brother. She closed the laptop and pressed her hands to her face. This was insane. She was spinning stories out of grief and exhaustion. There was no connection. It was just a ring, just a coincidence. But deep down, in the part of her that still remembered her mother's tears, she knew she was lying to herself. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong her entire life. And tonight, in that restaurant, she'd come face to face with the answer. She just didn't know it yet. Across the city, in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, Sheikh Rashid Al-Farhan stood by the window, the lights of Manhattan stretching endlessly before him. He'd dismissed his assistants an hour ago. He'd poured himself a scotch. He didn't drink. And now he stood in silence, the ring heavy on his finger. He'd worn this ring for 30 years. It had belonged to Khalid, his older brother, his protector, his best friend. When Khalid died, Rashid took it from the hospital, unable to leave any piece of him behind. The ring was gold, engraved with Arabic script along the outer band, words of faith, of strength. But there was something else, something Rashid had discovered only years after Khalid's death. A hidden engraving inside the band, so small it required magnification to read. He'd never told anyone about it. It felt sacred, private, a secret Khalid had carried to his grave. Tonight, after the incident at the restaurant, after the humiliation of that poor girl, Rashid had come home and done something he hadn't done in years. He'd removed the ring and looked at the engraving again. It was still there, etched in delicate script. For Sarah, my only love, Khalid. Rashid closed his eyes.
Sarah. He'd never known her name. Khalid had mentioned a woman once, an American woman he'd fallen in love with during his time in New York. Their father had forbidden the relationship. She wasn't Arab, wasn't Muslim, wasn't suitable. Khalid had fought back, had planned to marry her anyway. Then, he died. And the family had assumed the relationship died with him. But this ring said otherwise. Rashid opened his eyes and stared at the engraving until it blurred. Sarah. And tonight, in that restaurant, a girl with Sarah's eyes had served him dinner. He'd noticed it the moment she looked at him, the shape of her face, the way she held her hands, the sadness in her gaze that seemed too deep for someone so young. He'd dismissed it as coincidence, grief playing tricks on his mind. He'd been thinking about Khalid more than usual lately. His death anniversary was approaching. But now, standing alone in the dark, Rashid couldn't shake the feeling. That girl. Emily. She'd looked at his ring like she recognized it. No, that was impossible. He downed the scotch in one burning gulp and set the glass down too hard. He'd accused her of theft. He'd humiliated her in front of everyone. And she'd been innocent. He should apologize. But Rashid Al-Farhan didn't apologize. He didn't make mistakes. He didn't allow himself the weakness of doubt. And yet, He pulled out his phone and texted his head of security. "I need background on someone. Emily Carter works at Le Palais d'Or. Everything. By tomorrow." He stared at the message for a long moment before hitting send. Then he stood by the window until dawn, the ring cold against his skin, and thought about his brother's grave. Emily didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through possibilities, connections, questions with no answers. By the time the sun rose, she'd made a decision. She was going to find out the truth, even if it destroyed her. The next morning, Emily called in sick to work. Her voice was hoarse, her excuse flimsy, but Michael didn't argue. He probably wanted her gone after the scene last night. She dressed in jeans and an old sweater, pulled her hair into a ponytail, and took the subway to the New York Public Library. If her mother had known Khalid Al-Farran, there had to be evidence, letters, records, something. She started with newspaper archives. She searched for Khalid's name, his death, anything connected to 1995. Articles appeared, his obituary, reports of the accident, tributes to his philanthropy, but nothing about a woman named Sarah. She tried birth records next, her own. It listed her mother's name, Sarah Whitman, and the father's name as unknown. Unknown! Her chest tightened. She searched her mother's name in combination with the Al-Farran family. Still nothing. It was as if their relationship had never existed. But relationships left traces. They always did. She went home and tore through the boxes she'd kept in her closet. Everything her mother had left behind when she died. Old clothes, books, photographs. Most of it was junk, things Emily couldn't bring herself to throw away. At the bottom of the last box, beneath a stack of her mother's journals, she found an envelope. It was yellowed with age, sealed, with no address or name, just a single word written on the front in her mother's handwriting. Someday. Emily's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter and a photograph. The photograph was of her mother and a man. They were standing in front of a fountain, somewhere sunny and beautiful. Her mother was laughing, her head thrown back, her hand on the man's chest, and the man, tall, broad-shouldered, with kind eyes, was looking at her like she was the only thing in the world. It was Khalid Al-Farran. Emily's breath stopped. She turned the photo over. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, Rome, 1994, the day he asked me to marry him. Tears blurred her vision. She set the photo down and unfolded the letter with shaking hands. It was written in her mother's looping script, the ink faded but still readable. My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And I'm so sorry. Sorry I couldn't tell you this while I was alive. Sorry I was too scared, too ashamed. Your father's name was Khalid Al-Farran, and he loved you before he even knew you existed. We met in New York when I was 22. I was working at a bookstore, barely making rent, and he came in one day looking for a specific translation of Rumi. We talked for hours. He came back the next day, and the next. By the end of the month, I was in love. He told me about his family, about their wealth, their expectations. He said it didn't matter, that he'd choose me over everything. And he did. He proposed to me in Rome, gave me a ring with an engraving inside, my name, his promise. I wore it every day. But his family found out. They forbade the marriage, threatened to disown him. He fought them, Emily. He fought so hard. Then he died. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after the funeral. I tried to contact his family, to tell them, but they wouldn't speak to me. His brother, Rashid, he sent someone to tell me to stay away, that the family wanted nothing to do with me. I was heartbroken, alone, scared. So I kept you hidden. I raised you by myself.
And I never told you because I didn't want you to grow up knowing you were unwanted by half your family. But you weren't unwanted by your father, Emily. He loved you. He would have been so proud of you. The ring, I lost it years ago. Sold it when we were desperate, when I couldn't make rent. I've regretted it every day since. It was all I had left of him. I'm sorry I couldn't give you more. Sorry I couldn't be stronger. But you are strong. You've always been strong. And you are loved. Forever, Mom. Emily's hands were shaking so violently that she dropped the letter. She pressed her fists against her mouth to keep from screaming. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He died trying to be with her mother, and his family, his brother, had pushed them away. Rashid. The man who'd accused her of theft, who'd looked at her with cold, indifferent eyes. He'd told her mother to stay away. Rage surged through her, hot and bitter. All her life she'd believed her father hadn't wanted her, that she wasn't enough, but he died before he could fight for her, and his family had made sure she never knew the truth. She grabbed her phone, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She was going to confront him. She was going to make him see what he'd done. But then she stopped. What would she say? That she'd found a letter? That her mother claimed to have known Khalid? He'd never believe her. Men like Rashid Al-Farhan didn't believe poor girls with desperate stories. She needed proof, real proof. And there was only one thing that could give her that. The ring. The ring her mother had sold years ago. The ring with the engraving inside. If it still existed, if she could find it. Her phone rang. She almost didn't answer, but the number was from the restaurant. Hello? It's Michael. His voice was stiff, uncomfortable. I need you to come in today. There's been a situation. What situation? Just come in. Now. He hung up. Emily stared at the phone, dread curling in her chest. Something was very, very wrong. She arrived at the restaurant an hour later. The morning shift was in full swing, but the moment she walked through the door, the kitchen staff went silent. Michael was waiting for her by the host stand, his arms crossed, his face grim. Emily, my office. She followed him, her heart pounding. The tiny office was cramped and windowless, smelling of stale coffee and paper. Michael closed the door and turned to face her. I'm letting you go. The words hit her like a fist. What? Effective immediately. You can collect your final paycheck at the end of the week. But why? I didn't do anything. The ring. They found the ring. I was innocent. Michael rubbed his face, looking genuinely uncomfortable. I know, but Sheikh Al-Farhan's people reached out this morning. They want you gone. They don't want you working here anymore. Emily's vision swam. He's doing this on purpose? I don't know. I don't care. He's one of our most important clients. If he wants you gone, you're gone. I'm sorry, Emily. I really am. She couldn't breathe. I need this job. I can't. I have rent. I have bills. I'm sorry, Michael repeated, but his tone was firm, final. Collect your things. I need you out in 10 minutes. She walked out of the office in a daze. The other staff wouldn't meet her eyes. She grabbed her coat from her locker, her hands numb, and stumbled out into the cold morning air. On the sidewalk, she stood still for a long moment, the city moving around her in a blur of sound and motion. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call she'd sworn she'd never make again. Hi, Mrs. Chen. It's Emily Carter. I know I'm 2 months late on rent, but I'm calling to ask, is there any way I can get an extension? Just 1 more week. I'll have the money, I promise. There was a long pause on the other end. I'm sorry, Emily, but I already filed the eviction notice. You have until the end of the month. The line went dead. Emily stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, and felt her entire world collapse. She had no job, no home, no savings. and the man responsible was living in a penthouse, untouched, uncaring. For the first time in her life, Emily felt something other than sadness. She felt rage. Pure, white-hot rage. And in that moment, standing alone on a Manhattan sidewalk, she made a decision. She was going to find that ring. She was going to prove who she was, and she was going to make Sheikh Rashid Al Farhan face the truth, even if it destroyed her, even if it destroyed him. Rashid received the background report on Emily Carter at noon. He read it in his office, the city skyline glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, his expression carved from stone. Emily Rose Carter, age 26. Mother, Sarah Whitman, deceased 2012. Father, unknown. No criminal record, no higher education. Worked as a waitress at Le Palais d'Or. Eviction notice filed. Bank account balance, $147. That was it. Her entire life, summarized on half a page. Rashid set the report down, his jaw tight. Sarah Whitman. He'd had his team search that name too. The results were minimal. A woman who worked low-wage jobs her entire life, who died of an undiagnosed heart condition at 43, who'd left behind a daughter and nothing else. No connection to the Al Farhan family, no evidence she'd ever known Khalid. And yet, Rashid opened the locked drawer of his desk and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a stack of letters, old and fragile, tied with string. He'd found them in Khalid's apartment after his death, hidden in the back of a closet. Love letters. He'd never read them. It felt like a violation, a trespass into his private grief. But now, with that girl's face haunting him, he untied the string and opened the first letter. My love, I'm writing this from the airport. I wish I didn't have to leave, but Father insists I return for the shareholders' meeting. I already miss you. I miss your laugh, your terrible coffee, the way you hum when you read. I know my family won't approve, but I don't care. You're the only thing that matters. I'll make them understand. I'll make them see what I see. Wait for me, Sarah. I'm coming back. And when I do, we'll never be apart again. Yours always, Khalid. Rashid's hands tightened on the paper. Sarah. The girl at the restaurant, Emily Carter, daughter of Sarah Whitman? No, it couldn't be. But the dates matched, the timeline matched, and deep down, beneath his denial, Rashid knew the truth. Emily Carter was Khalid's daughter, his niece, the girl he'd humiliated, the girl he'd gotten fired, the girl whose life he'd just destroyed. His phone buzzed, a text from his assistant. Dinner tonight with the investors, 7 p.m., don't forget. Rashid stared at the message, his mind elsewhere. Then he stood, grabbed his coat, and walked out without a word. He had to see her. Emily was packing her things when the knock came. She had spent the afternoon in a haze, throwing clothes into boxes, wrapping dishes in newspaper, moving through her apartment like a ghost. She had nowhere to go, no friends to call, no family to lean on. She was alone. The knock came again, louder this time. She wiped her eyes and opened the door. Sheikh Rashid Al Farhan stood in the hallway. For a moment, neither of them moved. Emily stared at him, her heart pounding, her mind blank with shock. He looked different in the daylight. Older, tired. His suit was still impeccable, but there was something cracked in his expression, something almost human. Emily Carter, he said. His voice was quieter than she remembered. What are you doing here? Her voice was flat, drained of emotion. I need to speak with you. No. She moved to close the door, but he put his hand out, stopping it. Please. The word was so unexpected, so foreign coming from his mouth, that she hesitated. 5 minutes, he said. That's all I'm asking. She should have slammed the door in his face, should have screamed at him, cursed him, made him feel even a fraction of the pain he had caused. But something in his eyes stopped her, something that looked almost like regret. She stepped back and let him in. He stood awkwardly in her tiny apartment, too large for the space, too polished for the peeling wallpaper and the sagging couch. He looked around, his expression unreadable, then turned to face her. "I'm sorry," he said. Emily laughed. It was a bitter, broken sound. "You're sorry? You got me fired? You're having me evicted? And you're sorry?" His jaw tightened. "I didn't know what? That I was a person? That I had a life? That your accusations would destroy me? I didn't tell you to fire you, but you made sure I couldn't work there anymore." He didn't deny it. Emily crossed her arms, her body trembling with rage. "Why are you here? What do you want?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me about your mother." The question hit her like cold water. "What? Your mother, Sarah Whitman. Tell me about her." Emily's breath caught. "How do you—" "I had you investigated." The words should have made her furious, but instead she felt something crack open inside her chest. "Why?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He just stared at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. And Emily realized something. He already knew. "You know who I am, don't you?" His silence was answer enough. Tears burned her eyes. "Then why are you here? To finish the job? To make sure I disappear completely?" "No," his voice was rough. "I'm here because I need to know the truth." "The truth?" Emily's voice rose. "The truth is that your brother loved my mother. He was going to marry her, and then he died, and your family threw her away like garbage." Rashid flinched. It was subtle, but she saw it. "My mother spent her entire life grieving him. She raised me alone, working herself to death, and she never told me about him because she thought I was unwanted, because your family made her believe that. I didn't—" He stopped. "I never—" But Emily could see it in his eyes. The guilt, the recognition.
"You did," she said quietly. "Maybe you didn't do it yourself, but your family did, and you let them." Rashid stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. Emily turned away, unable to look at him anymore. "Get out! Emily, get out!" Her voice cracked, and tears spilled down her cheeks. She heard him move toward the door, heard it open, but then he stopped. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swear, I didn't know about you." She didn't turn around. "It doesn't matter." "It does." "No, it doesn't, because you can't undo it. You can't give me back my mother. You can't give me back the father I never got to meet. You can't fix any of it." There was a long silence. Then he said, "But I can try." Emily turned, her vision blurred with tears. "What?" "I can try," he repeated. His expression was raw, stripped of its usual coldness. "I can't undo the past, but I can try to make this right." "How? By paying me off? By giving me money and pretending that fixes everything?" "No." He stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "I can tell you the truth about your father, about who he was, about how much he loved your mother." Emily's breath hitched. "He kept letters," Rashid said quietly, "from your mother. I found them after he died. I never read them, but I kept them. They're yours if you want them." Her legs felt weak. She sank onto the couch, her hands shaking. "Why would you do that?" "Because Khalid would have wanted it." His voice was thick with emotion. "And because you deserve to know the truth." Emily stared at him, this man who had destroyed her life, who was now offering her a piece of her father. "There's something else," Rashid said. He pulled off the ring, the gold ring with the intricate engravings, and held it out to her. "This belonged to your father, and there's something inside you need to see." She took it with trembling hands. It was heavier than she expected, warm from his skin. "Look at the inside of the band. You'll need light." She held it up to the window, tilting it until she could see the inner surface. And there, in tiny, delicate script, were the words, "For Sarah, my only love, Khalid." Emily's world stopped. The ring. The ring from the photograph. The ring her mother had lost. She said she sold it when we were desperate. She said she had no choice. Rashid's expression darkened. It was stolen. After Khalid died, someone took it from his belongings. I recovered it years later from a private collector. I didn't know. I didn't realize it had been meant for your mother. Emily couldn't breathe. She was holding her father's love in her hands, the proof that he had wanted her mother, that he had loved her. "I don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "If you knew about her, if you had the ring, why didn't you find her?" "I didn't know," Rashid said, his voice raw. "I knew Khalid had loved someone, but I didn't know her name. I didn't know about you. My family, they covered it up. They wanted to erase her from his history." "And you let them?" He didn't deny it. "Yes, I was younger, grief-stricken. I let them make decisions I should have questioned, and I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, Emily." She looked up at him, this man who looked so much like the photographs of her father, but felt like a stranger. "It's too late for sorry," she whispered. "I know." They stood there in the dim light of her apartment, the city humming beyond the walls, and for the first time, Rashid Al-Farran felt the full weight of his family's sins. And Emily Carter, holding her father's ring, felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, the beginning of understanding. Rashid left shortly after, but not before writing down an address and pressing it into Emily's hand. "The letters are at my office. Come tomorrow, please." She didn't respond. She just closed the door and stood there, the ring clenched in her fist until the sun set and the apartment grew dark. That night she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the ring, reading the engraving over and over until the words blurred. "For Sarah, my only love, Khalid." Her mother had been loved, truly, deeply loved, and her father had fought for that love, even against his family, even knowing it would cost him everything. Emily had spent her entire life believing she came from nothing, that she was the product of abandonment, of weakness, of mistakes. But this ring told a different story. She came from love. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The next morning, Emily took the subway to Rashid's office. It was a towering glass building in Midtown, the kind of place she never would have entered if not for this. Security stopped her at the front desk, but when she gave her name, they waved her through immediately. Rashid was waiting for her on the 40th floor. He led her into a private conference room, its windows overlooking the city. On the table was a small wooden box. "These are Khalid's letters," he said. "I haven't read them. I thought you should be the first." Emily approached the box slowly, her heart pounding. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of letters, yellowed with age, tied with string. She pulled one out and unfolded it carefully. "My darling Sarah, today I told my father about you. It didn't go well. He called you unsuitable, said I was throwing away my future. But he's wrong. You're not my future. You're my present, my everything. I know this will be hard. I know my family will fight us. But I won't give up. I can't. Losing you would be like losing air. I'll fix this, I promise. And when I do, we'll get married. I'll take you to the places you've always dreamed of. Paris, Cairo, Tokyo, anywhere you want. As long as I'm with you. I love you more than I have words for. Yours, Khalid. Emily's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the letter. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she read another and another, each one a window into a love she'd never known existed. Her father had been kind, romantic, stubborn. He'd fought for her mother with everything he had. And then he died. She looked up at Rashid, who was standing by the window, his back to her. He was going to marry her, she said, her voice thick with tears. He was really going to do it. I know, Rashid said quietly. And your family stopped him. They tried, but Khalid never gave up. The accident, it wasn't their doing. It was just uncruel fate. Emily wiped her eyes. Why didn't they tell her? After he died, why didn't they reach out? Rashid turned to face her, his expression heavy with guilt, pride, fear. My father thought your mother was trying to exploit Khalid's death to claim money from the family. He sent lawyers to threaten her, to make her go away. I was 22. I didn't question it. I should have, but I didn't. She was pregnant, she whispered. She was alone and pregnant, and they threatened her. I know. His voice was raw. And I will carry that shame for the rest of my life. Emily looked down at the letters, at her father's handwriting, and felt something break open inside her. I don't know how to forgive you, she said. I'm not asking you to. Then what do you want? He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, I want to give you what Khalid would have wanted you to have. Your inheritance, your place in the family, your name. Emily's breath caught. What? You're Khalid's daughter. You're an Al-Faran, and I want to make sure you're taken care of. I don't want your money. I'm not offering charity, Rashid said firmly. I'm offering what's rightfully yours. Khalid left behind a trust. It was supposed to go to his children. You're his child.
Emily shook her head, overwhelmed. I can't. This is too much. It's not, Rashid said. He stepped closer, his dark eyes intense. Emily, you spent your entire life fighting alone. Let me help you. Not because I'm trying to erase the past, but because it's what Khalid would have wanted. She looked at him, this man who had hurt her, who was now offering her more than she'd ever dreamed of. And she realized something. He wasn't doing this out of guilt. He was doing it out of love. Love for his brother. Love for the family that should have been. I need time, she whispered. Take all the time you need. She gathered the letters carefully and stood to leave. But at the door she paused. Rashid? He turned. Thank you. For keeping these. For giving them to me. His expression softened just slightly. Your father would have loved you very much. Emily nodded, unable to speak, and left. But as she walked out into the cold New York morning, the letters pressed against her chest, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Over the next few weeks, Emily's life transformed in ways she never could have imagined. Rashid arranged for her eviction to be canceled, her rent paid in full for the next year. He connected her with a lawyer who began the process of establishing her paternity, of claiming her rightful place as Khalid Al-Farkhan's daughter. He offered her a job, not as a waitress, but as a consultant for the Khalid Al-Farkhan Memorial Foundation, helping to distribute scholarships to underprivileged students. Emily accepted, not because she needed the money, though she did, but because it felt right, like a way to honor the father she'd never known. She read Khalid's letters over and over, learning about the man who had loved her mother so fiercely. She learned that he'd played the guitar, that he'd loved poetry, that he dreamed of opening a school for refugee children. She learned that he'd been kind, generous, and stubborn as hell. She learned that she was like him. And slowly, carefully, she began to let Rashid into her life. It wasn't easy. There were days when she looked at him and saw only the man who had humiliated her, days when the hurt was too raw to push past.
But there were also days when she saw flashes of Khalid in him, the way he listened, the way he cared about people even when he pretended not to. One evening, 3 months after their first meeting, Rashid invited her to dinner at his penthouse. Emily almost declined, but something made her say yes. The penthouse was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows, sleek furniture, art on the walls that probably cost more than her entire life. But it felt cold, empty. Rashid cooked dinner himself, which surprised her. They ate in awkward silence at first, but eventually the conversation began to flow. "Tell me about your mother," Rashid asked. "What was she like?" Emily hesitated. She'd spent so long guarding her memories, afraid to share them, but something about the way he asked, gentle, genuine, made her open up. "She was kind," Emily said. "Too kind, maybe. She always put other people first, even when we had nothing. She used to sing while she cooked, even though she couldn't carry a tune. And she loved books. We'd go to the library every Saturday and she'd check out a dozen at a time." Rashid smiled faintly. "Khalid loved books too. That's how they met, wasn't it? At a bookstore." "Yeah." Emily looked down at her plate. "She said he came in looking for Rumi. He loved Rumi, used to quote him all the time, drove our father crazy." They both laughed, soft and bittersweet. "I wish I'd known him," Emily said quietly. "I wish you had, too." There was a long pause. Then Rashid said, "He would have been proud of you. The way you've handled all this, the strength, the grace, that's all him." Emily's throat tightened. "I don't feel strong." "You are. You've survived things that would have broken most people, and you did it alone." "Not anymore," she said, looking up at him. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Emily saw something in Rashid that she hadn't noticed before. Pain. Deep, unhealed pain. "You miss him." Rashid's jaw tightened. "Every day." "Tell me about him. Not the letters, not the stories. Tell me about your brother." And so he did. He told her about the time Khalid had snuck him out of school to go to a concert, about how Khalid had taught him to drive, even though he had crashed the car into a fence, about how Khalid had stood up to his father time and time again, refusing to be molded into something he wasn't. "He was my best friend," Rashid said, his voice thick. "When he died, I didn't just lose a brother. I lost the only person who really understood me." Emily reached across the table and took his hand. He stared down at their joined hands, his expression raw and vulnerable. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for your mother," he said. "I'm sorry I let my family push her away. I'm sorry you had to grow up without him." "I know," Emily said, "and I'm sorry you lost him." They sat there in silence, two people bound by grief and love for the same man, and something shifted between them. Not quite forgiveness, but something close. The beginning of healing. But peace was short-lived. A week later, Emily received a call from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of her. "Hello?" "Emily Carter?" The voice was female, sharp, with a faint accent. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Layla Haddad. I think we need to talk." Emily's stomach tightened. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. "About what?" "About Khalid al-Farkhan and the lies you've been spreading about him." The line went dead. Emily stared at her phone, her heart pounding. Who the hell was Layla Haddad? She called Rashid immediately. "Do you know someone named Layla Haddad?" she asked as soon as he picked up. There was a long pause. Then Rashid's voice, low and dangerous. "What did she say to you?" "She said I was spreading lies about Khalid. Who is she?" Another pause. "She was Khalid's fiancée before he met your mother." Emily's blood ran cold. "His fiancée?" "It was arranged. Khalid broke off the engagement when he fell in love with Sarah. Layla never forgave him." "Why is she calling me now?" "I don't know," Rashid said, his voice tight. "But I'm going to find out. Don't respond to her. Don't engage. I'll handle this." But it was already too late. The next morning, Emily woke to her phone exploding with notifications. Text messages, emails, calls from numbers she didn't know. She opened Twitter and her blood turned to ice. A gossip blog had published an article, "Billionaire Sheikh Rashid Al Farhan's secret affair with former waitress." The article was filled with lies. It claimed Emily was Rashid's mistress, that she'd been fired from the restaurant for inappropriate behavior, that she was using a fabricated story about being Khalid's daughter to extort money from the family. Attached were photos, doctored photos, of Emily and Rashid together, taken out of context. Emily's hands shook as she scrolled through the comments, hundreds of them, calling her a gold digger, a liar, a whore. Her phone rang. Rashid. "Emily, don't read it, don't—" "It's too late," she said, her voice hollow. "Everyone's seen it." "I'm going to fix this. I'm calling my lawyers. We'll sue for defamation. It's her, isn't it? Lela." Silence. "She did this because she can't stand that Khalid chose my mother over her." "I'll handle her," Rashid said, his voice cold as steel. "I promise she won't get away with this." But the damage was done. By the end of the day, Emily's face was plastered across tabloid sites. Reporters camped outside her apartment. She couldn't leave without being swarmed. She felt like she was drowning. That night, Rashid showed up at her door with 2 security guards. "You're not staying here," he said.
"I'm not running away. This isn't running. This is protecting yourself. Pack a bag. You're staying at my place until this blows over." Emily wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't asking. He was begging. She packed a bag and left with him, the security guards flanking them as they pushed through the crowd of reporters. At his penthouse, Rashid set her up in a guest room with a view of the park. He ordered food, made sure she had everything she needed, and then sat with her in the living room, the city lights twinkling below. "I'm sorry," he said. "This is my fault. I should have known Lila would retaliate." "It's not your fault," Emily said. She's angry, and she's taking it out on me. I won't let her destroy you." Emily looked at him, this man who had gone from enemy to ally to something she couldn't quite name. "Why do you care so much?" she asked quietly. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Because you're family, and because I've already failed you once. I won't do it again." Tears pricked her eyes. "Thank you." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, we fight back." And they did. Rashid's lawyers moved swiftly. They filed a defamation lawsuit against Lila and the gossip blog. They released a statement clarifying Emily's relationship to the Al Farhan family, including DNA evidence proving her paternity. The media frenzy intensified, but this time the narrative shifted. People began to see Emily not as a gold digger, but as a victim, a woman who had been abandoned by her father's family, who had struggled her entire life, and who was now being attacked for claiming what was rightfully hers. Public opinion turned, and Lila, facing legal consequences and public backlash, went silent. But the damage to Emily was done. She couldn't go back to her old life, couldn't disappear into anonymity. She was Emily Al Farhan now, whether she wanted to be or not. One night, a month after the scandal broke, Emily stood on Rashid's balcony staring out at the city. She felt raw, exhausted, but also strangely lighter. She'd survived. Rashid joined her, 2 mugs of tea in his hands. He handed her one without a word. They stood in silence, the cold air biting at their skin. "Do you regret it?" Rashid asked, coming forward, claiming your place in the family. Emily considered. "No, it's been hell, but I finally know the truth. I finally know who I am." "And who are you?"
She smiled faintly. Khalid's daughter. Sarah's daughter. A survivor. You're more than that, Rashid said quietly. She looked at him. What do you mean? You're the best parts of them. The kindness, the strength, the stubbornness. He smiled just a little. You're everything Khalid hoped for. Emily's throat tightened. I wish I could have told him. That I turned out okay? He knows. They stood there until the tea went cold. Two people bound by loss and love, learning to build something new from the ruins of the past. 6 months later, Emily stood in a cemetery in Dubai. The sky was impossibly blue, the sun warm on her skin. Beside her, Rashid stood silently, his expression somber. Khalid's grave was simple, a white marble headstone with Arabic script. Emily knelt down and placed a bouquet of roses at its base. Hi, Dad. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. Her voice broke, but she continued. I know what you did for her. Mom told me about you. Not everything, but enough. She said you loved us, and I believe her. I wish you were here. I wish I could have known you, but I'm grateful for the time you had with her, for the love you gave her. It made me possible. She pulled out the ring with the engraving, and held it up to the light. I found this. Rashid gave it to me, and I want you to know it's safe now. Your love is safe. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. Thank you for fighting for her. Thank you for loving her. And thank you for being my father, even if we never got to meet. She pressed her hand to the headstone, closed her eyes, and let herself feel the grief she'd been carrying her entire life. And then, slowly, she let it go. Rashid stepped forward and placed his hand on her shoulder. He would have loved you so much. Emily looked up at him, her eyes red but clear. I know. They stood there together, uncle and niece, family forged not by blood alone, but by choice, by pain, by love. And for the first time in her life, Emily Carter felt like she belonged. Months passed. Emily threw herself into the work at the Khalid Al-Farhan Memorial Foundation. She met students who had been given scholarships, heard their stories, saw the impact her father's legacy was having. It filled her with a sense of purpose she'd never known. Rashid and Emily grew closer, not in a romantic way, that would have been absurd, but as family, real family. He taught her about her father's culture, took her to Dubai to meet extended relatives, showed her the world Khalid had come from. And slowly, Emily began to heal. But there was one last piece of the puzzle she needed. One night, Emily asked Rashid about the day Khalid died. They were sitting in his study, the fire crackling, the city dark beyond the windows. I need to know, she said. How did he die? His expression darkened. Emily, please, I need to know. He was silent for a long time. Then he began. Khalid had been in New York for 6 months. He was supposed to return to Dubai for a family meeting, but he kept delaying. My father was furious. Finally, Khalid agreed to come back, but only to tell them he was marrying Sarah. He was going to stand up to them, no matter what. Rashid's voice grew thick with emotion. He was driving to the airport when it happened. Another car ran a red light, hit him head on. He died instantly. Emily's breath hitched. He was coming back to fight for her. Yes. Did she know? I don't know. I don't think so. After he died, the family buried the engagement, the relationship, everything. They wanted to protect his reputation. I didn't question it. I was young, stupid, grieving. I just let them erase her. Emily reached out and took his hand. It's not your fault. It feels like it is. It's not, she said firmly. You were grieving. You made mistakes, but you're fixing them now. That's what matters." Rashid looked at her, his eyes glistening. "You're too forgiving." "No, I'm just tired of being angry." They sat in silence, the fire casting shadows on the walls. And in that moment, Emily realized something. She'd spent her entire life feeling unwanted, feeling like she was a mistake, a burden, something to be hidden. But she wasn't. She was the product of a love so fierce it defied families, cultures, expectations. A love that survived even death. And that was something worth holding on to. A year after Emily first walked into Rashid's office, she stood at a podium in front of 200 people. It was the annual gala for the Khalid Al-Farhan Memorial Foundation, and she'd been asked to speak. Her hands trembled as she looked out at the crowd. Donors, students, faculty, family. Rashid sat in the front row, his expression proud. "Good evening. My name is Emily Al-Farhan, and a year ago, I didn't know that name was mine." She told her story, not the tabloid version, not the scandal, but the truth. The story of a young woman who grew up without a father, who discovered a love story buried beneath years of silence, who learned that family wasn't just blood, it was choice. "My father, Khalid, fought for love. He fought for my mother. And even though he never got to meet me, his love shaped my entire life. Because of him, I exist. And because of his family, because of my uncle, Rashid, I'm finally able to honor that love." She looked at Rashid, who nodded slightly.
This foundation exists to help young people who feel invisible, who feel like the world has forgotten them. I was one of those people, and I want to make sure no one else has to feel that way again. The room erupted in applause. Later, after the speeches and the dinner and the endless handshakes, Emily found herself alone on the balcony, staring up at the stars. Rashid joined her. "You did well tonight," he said. "I was terrified. You didn't show it." They stood in comfortable silence. "Thank you," Emily said, "for everything, for believing me, for helping me, for being family." "You don't need to thank me." "I do, because you didn't have to do any of this. You could have walked away, but you didn't." Rashid turned to face her, his expression serious. "You're Khalid's daughter. You're my niece. Walking away was never an option." Emily smiled, tears in her eyes. "I'm glad." "Me too." They stood there, beneath the stars, and Emily felt a peace she'd never known. She thought of her mother, of her father, of the love that had brought her into the world, and she knew, finally, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. 2 years after the night at the restaurant, Emily returned to Le Palais d'Or. She wasn't working there, she didn't need to, but she'd been invited to a private dinner, a reunion of sorts. Michael, the manager, greeted her at the door, his expression sheepish. "Miss Al-Farhan, it's an honor." She smiled faintly. "It's just Emily." He led her to the same corner table where everything had begun. Rashid was already there, dressed impeccably as always. But this time, when he looked at her, his eyes were warm. "Thank you for coming." "Of course." They ordered dinner, made small talk, but eventually the conversation turned serious. "I've been thinking," Rashid said, "about the future, about the foundation, about the family, and I want you to take over." Emily blinked. "What?" "You are better at this than I am. You understand the students, the mission. You care in a way I never could." "Rashid, I can't." "You can, and you will." He smiled. "Khalid would have wanted it."
And so do I. Emily's throat tightened. I don't know what to say. Say yes. She laughed, tears in her eyes. Yes! They clinked glasses, and for the first time since she'd walked into this restaurant 2 years ago, Emily felt truly free. Later, as she stood to leave, she paused by the table. She ran her hand along the edge, remembering the night the ring had fallen, the night everything had changed. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. Rashid nodded. "Every day." "Do you regret it?" He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I regret how it happened, the pain I caused you, but I don't regret where it led us." Emily smiled. "Me neither." She walked out into the cool night air, the city alive around her, and felt a sense of completeness she'd never known. Her mother had loved, her father had fought, and she had survived. And in the end, that was enough. The final scene came on a rainy afternoon in late autumn. Emily stood in a small gallery in Brooklyn, surrounded by photographs. They were hers, images she'd taken over the past year, of students at the foundation, of her father's grave, of Rashid standing by the window, lost in thought. Photography had become her refuge, her way of processing everything that had happened. The gallery was quiet, only a few visitors wandering through. But then the door opened, and Rashid walked in. He stood in front of a photograph of Khalid's headstone, the roses Emily had placed there still fresh. "This is beautiful," he said quietly. "Thank you." He turned to face her. "You've come so far, Emily. I'm proud of you." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You could have. You're stronger than you know." They stood there in the quiet gallery, surrounded by images of grief and love and healing. And Emily realized something. She wasn't just Khalid's daughter, or Sarah's daughter, or even Rashid's niece. She was Emily. Just Emily. And that was more than enough. Outside, the rain fell softly, washing the city clean. And somewhere in the space between memory and hope, a love story that began 30 years ago finally found its ending. Not in tragedy, but in forgiveness, in family, in the understanding that love, even when it's lost, never truly dies. It lives on in the people it creates. And Emily El Farhan was living proof.